There's a training Japanese monks have practiced for over 1,000 years that lets them stand under freezing waterfalls without flinching. And today you'll learn the actual mechanism behind it, because it has almost nothing to do with toughness. Have you ever avoided something simply because it would be uncomfortable? Not dangerous, not harmful, just unpleasant. A cold shower, a hard conversation, a workout you knew would burn. Most people spend their entire lives quietly steering around discomfort, and they call it self-care, when really, it's just avoidance wearing a nicer name. There's an ancient Japanese practice called Shugyo, and it was never about becoming immune to pain. It was about discovering that pain and suffering are two completely different things, and that almost everyone confuses them for their entire life. Before I show you exactly how the monks do this, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and comment one uncomfortable thing you've been avoiding. Let's go. Chapter 1. The Avoidance. The story I'm about to tell you happened to a woman named Elena. Elena wasn't in pain, not in any medical sense. She was simply someone who had spent years arranging her entire life around comfort, so gradually and so quietly that she never noticed herself doing it. She took the elevator instead of the stairs, not because she was tired, but because 2 flights felt like an unnecessary inconvenience. She avoided difficult conversations with her sister for 3 years, letting a small disagreement calcify into distance, because raising it felt harder than simply not raising it. She wanted to run a race one day, had wanted to for a decade, but every time she laced up her shoes for the first mile, her body screamed at her to stop somewhere around minute 4, and she always listened. She told herself this was self-awareness, listening to her body, not pushing too hard. But underneath that story was something simpler and less flattering. She had built her entire life around a single unconscious rule. If it's uncomfortable, stop. And the rule had quietly shrunk her world for years without her ever noticing the walls closing in. Because avoidance doesn't announce itself. It just feels like reasonable choices, one small, comfortable decision at a time. The turning point came on an ordinary Tuesday, not from some dramatic crisis, but from a doctor casually mentioning, during a routine appointment, that her resting heart rate and general fitness markers were those of someone a decade older than she actually was. Nothing alarming, nothing urgent, just a quiet, clinical observation that landed harder than it should have. Elena went home that night and sat with a question she'd never actually asked herself directly. Was she avoiding pain, or was she avoiding discomfort? And had she ever once stopped to check whether those were the same thing? She didn't know it yet, but she was about to discover that an entire discipline, developed over centuries in Japanese mountain monasteries, existed specifically to answer that question. Not through willpower, not through gritting her teeth and pushing harder, through something far stranger, learning to listen to sensation without immediately translating it into a story about danger. Chapter 2. The Ancient Discipline. On Mount Hiei, near Kyoto, Tendai Buddhist monks have practiced a training called Kaihogyo for over 1,000 years, a marathon of mountain circuits so demanding that historically, monks who could not complete it were expected to take their own lives rather than fail publicly. A tradition that shaped how seriously the practice was taken, even as the ritual itself evolved. Some monks run distances equivalent to running a marathon every single day, for 100 consecutive days, through mountain terrain, in sandals, regardless of weather. Separately, in what's called misogi, monks stand beneath freezing waterfalls for extended periods, sometimes chanting, sometimes silent, letting water colder than most people can tolerate for even a few seconds pour directly onto them for minutes at a time. From the outside, this looks like pure suffering, and most people assume the monks are simply tougher or numb or somehow immune to sensation the rest of us aren't. That assumption is almost entirely wrong, and it misses the actual mechanism completely. Here's what modern pain science has confirmed about what these monks were doing centuries before anyone had a word for it. Pain, the raw physical sensation, and suffering, the psychological experience layered on top of it, are processed in genuinely different regions of the brain. The sensation of cold water, or muscle fatigue, or a burning lung on mile 12, is simply data. Information traveling up the nervous system, arriving in the brain as a neutral signal. This is cold. This is intense. This is happening. Suffering only begins when a second, entirely separate process kicks in. The mind's narrative layer, interpreting that data and attaching a story to it. This is dangerous. This will not stop. I cannot handle this. Make it end. A pain researcher who has studied meditation practitioners under fMRI found something that reframes the entire conversation around discomfort. Experienced meditators, when exposed to the same painful stimulus as untrained subjects, showed nearly identical activity in the brain regions that register the raw sensation. The sensation itself was not reduced, not blunted, not numbed. What was dramatically reduced was activity in the regions responsible for the emotional narrative wrapped around that sensation. The anticipatory dread, the catastrophizing, the mental story of suffering. The monks were never eliminating pain. They were severing it from suffering, treating them as the two separate events they had been all along. Chapter 3. The Cold Water Rule. Elena's first attempt at applying this wasn't a waterfall. It was her shower, turned to cold, for exactly 30 seconds. It sounds almost comically small compared to Shugyo, and that's precisely why it worked as a starting point, rather than something she'd quit within a week. The first morning, the cold hit her chest, and her mind did exactly what minds do. It screamed, "Get out! This is unbearable. Something is wrong." Every instinct told her the sensation itself was the problem. That 30 seconds under cold water was somehow a genuine emergency requiring immediate escape. She didn't get out. She stood there, and instead of fighting the sensation or trying to distract herself away from it, she was taught to do something almost unnervingly simple. Just notice it. Name it without judgment. Cold, sharp, intense on the chest. Nothing more added on top. By the second week, something had shifted, and it wasn't that the water felt warmer or less intense. The physical sensation was identical every single time. Cold water is cold water, and no amount of practice changes its temperature. What changed was the split-second gap between the sensation arriving and her mind's old panic response firing automatically. That gap, barely noticeable at first, began to widen. She could feel the cold fully, completely, with total clarity, and simultaneously notice that her mind's old story, "This is an emergency, escape now," no longer arrived automatically alongside it. The sensation and the narrative had started, for the first time in her life, to come apart. This is the actual mechanism behind misogi, stripped down to its smallest usable form. The waterfall was never really the point. The point was practicing, deliberately and repeatedly, the skill of experiencing intense sensation without immediately converting it into a story about danger. Once that skill exists in miniature, in a shower, it becomes available everywhere else discomfort shows up. In a hard workout, a difficult conversation, a deadline that feels overwhelming. The monks weren't training pain tolerance, they were training the gap. Chapter 4. The Real Obstacle. But cold showers solved a problem Elena hadn't actually been most afraid of. The real obstacle wasn't physical discomfort at all. It was the conversation with her sister, 3 years overdue, and every time she considered finally having it, a different kind of discomfort rose up. Not cold on skin, but something that felt, in her body, disturbingly similar. Tight chest, shallow breath. The same physiological signature as standing under freezing water, except this time triggered entirely by an imagined conversation that hadn't even happened yet. This is where Shugyo's second layer reveals itself, and it's the part almost nobody realizes when they picture monks purely enduring physical hardship. The discipline was never limited to physical sensation. Emotional discomfort, the tightness of an awkward silence, the vulnerability of admitting fault, the fear of a difficult reaction, registers in the nervous system through nearly identical channels as physical pain. The brain doesn't neatly separate a hard conversation from a hard workout. Both arrive at the level of raw sensation, as intensity the body would rather avoid. Elena applied the same practice she'd learned in the shower to the conversation she'd been avoiding for 3 years. Before calling her sister, she noticed the tightness rising in her chest, the same signature she'd learned to name without immediately fleeing from. Cold water, tight chest, both, simply, sensation. She let herself feel the discomfort fully, instead of letting the mind's old story, "This will go badly, this is unbearable," avoid it, make the decision for her automatically before she'd even picked up the phone. A researcher studying exposure-based therapy for chronic avoidance found a pattern worth naming directly. People don't actually avoid the difficult event itself nearly as often as they avoid the anticipated sensation of approaching it. The dread beforehand is almost always worse, and almost always more influential over behavior than whatever discomfort the actual event eventually produces. Once Elena could sit with that anticipatory dread without letting it drive the decision, the conversation itself, awkward, honest, occasionally uncomfortable, turned out to be entirely survivable. In a way the 3 years of avoidance never let her discover on her own. Chapter 5. Compounding Exposure. Here's where Shugyo becomes something closer to a training system than a single technique, and it's the part the mountain monks understood better than almost anyone. Discomfort tolerance compounds exactly the way physical strength does, and it atrophies the exact same way when neglected. A monk doesn't run the full 100-day Kaihogyo circuit on his first attempt. The distances build, deliberately, across years of preparation, each stage calibrated just past what feels comfortable, never so far past it that the nervous system simply shuts down in overwhelm. Elena's practice expanded the same way, almost without her deliberately planning it. The cold shower became 2 minutes instead of 30 seconds. The 4-minute wall in her running, the point where her body used to scream at her to stop, slowly moved to 6 minutes, then 10. Not because her lungs had somehow changed, but because the gap she'd trained, sensation without automatic panic, had grown wide enough to hold more intensity before it closed. The conversation with her sister, once unthinkable, made a second, harder conversation with a difficult colleague feel merely uncomfortable instead of impossible. Nobody around her noticed the shift happening in real time, because compounding never looks dramatic while it's underway. It only looks that way afterward, in hindsight, when someone compares who she used to be to who she'd quietly become across months of small, repeated exposures. This is precisely why most people who attempt something like a single cold shower once, as an experiment, give up within a week and conclude the practice doesn't work. They mistake the absence of instant transformation for evidence of failure when the actual mechanism was never designed to work instantly. It was designed to compound, the same way a monk's tolerance for a 100-day mountain circuit is built one deliberately uncomfortable day at a time, not summoned whole on the first morning. Chapter 6. Pre-solving the panic. Even with months of practice, Elena still hit moments where the old panic response returned in full force, sudden and overwhelming, exactly as it always had. A genuine crisis at work. An unexpected confrontation she hadn't prepared for. In those moments, the trained gap between sensation and story sometimes collapsed instantly, exactly the way it had before any of this training began. And the old instinct to flee discomfort came roaring back with its full original force. This is where she borrowed something else from the monastic tradition, a principle that shows up again and again wherever this kind of training is taken seriously. The monks of Mount Hiei don't rely purely on willpower to get through the hardest sections of the mountain circuit. They pre-decide their physical and mental responses to specific known difficulties in advance, long before exhaustion or panic can compromise their judgment in the moment. A particular steep section gets a particular breathing pattern, decided in training, executed automatically when the terrain arrives, with no negotiation left to make in real time. Elena built her own version of this. For genuine crisis moments, the kind that made even her trained sensation naming feel impossible to access in the heat of it, she wrote down, in advance, a single physical anchor. 3 slow breaths, hand pressed flat against her own chest, before responding to anything. Not a solution to the crisis itself, just a pre-decided pause, written during a calm moment, specifically so she wouldn't have to invent one during a panicked one. The decision, Like the monk's breathing pattern on the mountain's hardest slope, had already been made before the difficulty arrived, which meant there was nothing left to negotiate when it finally did. Chapter 7. The Transformation. A year into practicing this, Elena ran the race she'd wanted to run for a decade. Not because her legs had become dramatically stronger, though they had, but because the 4-minute wall that used to end every attempt no longer triggered the automatic story that used to stop her. This is unbearable. I need to quit. She felt the exact same burning in her lungs at mile 4 that she'd always felt. The sensation hadn't changed at all. What had changed was that the sensation no longer came pre-packaged with a story demanding she obey it. Friends who knew her before struggled to explain what was different about her, because nothing about the change was visible in any single dramatic moment. She hadn't become fearless. She still felt cold water as genuinely cold, still felt the tightness of a hard conversation as genuinely uncomfortable. What had changed, invisibly and completely, was the gap, the space between a sensation arriving and a story about that sensation deciding her next move. That gap, trained one cold shower and one honest conversation at a time, had become wide enough to hold almost anything life put through it. That's the actual secret behind monks who appear to feel no pain, standing motionless beneath a freezing waterfall. They feel every drop of it, completely. What they've trained away isn't the sensation. It's the automatic surrender to a story that was never actually true. That discomfort and danger are the same thing, and that both demand the same response. Once you separate those two, the waterfall is just cold water. The hard conversation is just words, and the life you've been quietly avoiding for years becomes, simply, available again. If this changed how you think about discomfort, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. And tell me in the comments, what's the one uncomfortable thing you've been avoiding, that you're finally ready to feel instead of run from?